first video of term 2, week 3, so a little bit late, but better late than never, hey? So the first half of the video is a bit of a revision over what we've done so far, and then a bit of a preview of where we're going in this next week. And of course there'll be another video next week, next Thursday. So sit back for those people that haven't missed a class and just sort of listen for the first few slides. For those people that have been absent though, obviously you might need to be taking some notes and pausing. And then the second half, obviously you might all like to take some notes, but there's not too many at all. Quite a few diagrams in fact, which means you just need to kind of sit back and take it in. And you'll have the opportunity to label some of these diagrams in class in the coming week. Okay, when my computer decides to work, there we go. So the first thing that we've covered, of course, last week or this week is the neuron. And you can see down there I've got a picture of the neuron. Most of you have made a neuron. You've got a diagram of the neuron in your book as well. Make sure that you know how to label it. So in terms of the dendrites, the soma, wouldn't hurt to know the nucleus, but I don't think that would be on an exam. The axon, myelin sheath, and you can see here it's called the axon terminals, but we know I also call them the synaptic terminals or the synaptic buttons. So just make sure you know where they all are. We know that the neuron is the basic building block of the nervous system. We know that they send electrochemical information, so it's electrical through the neuron and it's chemical in between. And of course the space in between is called the synapse. This information only travels in one direction. For this reason we have sensory neurons that take information to the brain. We have motor neurons that take information from the brain, and we've got interneurons actually within the central nervous system. And we know that neurons can never be replaced, so we really need to look after them. We then went on to talk about the divisions of the nervous system, central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. We know that the central nervous system is centrally located in our body and it's made up of the brain and the spinal cord. We know that the peripheral nervous system is made up of the somatic and autonomic divisions, and both of those are found outside the central nervous system because the word peripheral means everything to the side of the central nervous system. The somatic nervous system has both a motor component, so moving skeletal muscles, and also a sensory component, so receiving sensory information from organs and taking that information to the central nervous system. The autonomic nervous system basically has two divisions: the sympathetic nervous system that prepares us for confronting or escaping a situation, and the parasympathetic, which will bring us back to a state of rest and keep us balanced through most of our normal functioning. This diagram is slightly different to the one that you got in class. We kind of moved the motor neurons and sensory neuron part off the somatic nervous system when we spoke about its functions. So hopefully you don't find it too confusing. Okay, just a quick example of the kind of knowledge you need. I went through this with most of the classes, or all three of the classes anyway, but we know that sensory neurons in the somatic division take information to the from the peripheral nervous system via afferent pathways to the central nervous system, and we know that the motor neurons in that same somatic division of the PNS takes the same information then back via efferent pathways from the CNS to muscles, organs and glands. So you should know that information pretty well by now. And that's just a summary of course, the diagram, or you've got a similar diagram, and there's one in your book as well in terms of some of the effects that the sympathetic nervous system has on our body, and then the parasympathetic is the opposite effect. Just remember that you need to know the survival reasons as to why. So the fact that the pupils dilate to allow more light, so therefore we can assess a situation. So just make sure you've got an idea of what happens with most of the major organs of the body during the time of stress and then during the time of calm. Okay, so moving on to the next section, which we're going to cover in the next few classes, which is the brain. Basically, I want to do a bit of brain geography with you, just so you can get used to some of the language that's going to be used in the coming week or two. So basically, we've got three sections of the brain that we often refer to. We've got the front section, which is called the forebrain. and with fore meaning front. And even though it's fore means front, it's not really the front of the brain, but it's the sort of top section of the brain. We have the middle section of the brain in the green, which is called the midbrain. It's the middle. And then we have the hindbrain, and the word hind means back. Okay, so if you think about behind, it means your backside. So the back brain, which is really the lower part of the brain, which you can see there in pink. And I'll go through this in class, but you know, if I'm ever talking about the forebrain, I'm talking about the top part. If I'm ever talking about the hindbrain, I'm talking about the bottom part, back part, and then of course we have the midbrain. We often talk about left and right hemispheres, which is just really a fancy way of saying the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain. Hemispheres is just the halves, the technical term. Okay, so we have a left and right hemisphere, so basically two halves to our brain. But those two halves are connected by something called the corpus callosum. And you can see here the corpus callosum is in orange. And basically that connects the left and right hemisphere. It can be cut during split brain surgery, which we'll learn about next week, which is often done in epileptic patients, and that does have some side effects. And like I said, we'll talk about that next week. This corpus callosum is basically the main means of communication between the left and right hemisphere. And again, I'll show you this again on a model during class as well. Okay. We then often talk about the cerebral cortex, which is basically the very thin layer or covering of the entire forebrain. Okay, so that top section of the brain. It's only about 3 millimeters thick, and because it's such a thin layer, it doesn't have any protective function. It basically has a communication function and a nourishing function. It's almost like you've got a layer of glad wrap over your entire brain. The amazing thing about this particular structure is that it does contain 3/4 of your entire nervous system's neurons. So that's a lot of neurons in a very small space. Humans have the largest cerebral cortex, and this basically allows us to obviously be at the top of the food chain, the most intelligent animals. And it's because of all the folds and grooves in our cerebral cortex, which actually ensures that it's quite larger or quite large. In class, we'll have a look at a couple of different animals and their brains, and we'll have a little bit of a comparison. But basically, the folds and groove increase the surface area, allowing more space for more neurons, more oxygen, more energy, more nourishment. Smarter organism is basically how it goes. Okay, you also need to know the general geography of the rest of the brain. So basically the orange section is the frontal lobe, and we'll go through this in class. The purple section is the parietal lobe, the back greenish section is the occipital lobe, and then the section that kind of still looks purple but it's got a bit more blue in it is the temporal lobe. You have to know what those 4 lobes are, and you should be able to label them in a diagram. But then you also need to know some of the key sections in those lobes. And you can see this diagram does actually point to most of them, but on the next slide I've got a list of what you need to know. I won't give you notes on it in this PowerPoint because that's a lot of information. You will get them in class already pre-typed for you, and hopefully you can stick them in the book and label the diagram, and we can start learning about what each section does. So the sections that you actually need to know, like I said, the frontal lobe, but in particular there's 3 spots in the frontal lobe, the motor cortex, Broca's area, and the association cortex. In the parietal lobe you need to know about the somatosensory cortex and where it's located and the other association areas. The occipital lobe you need to know where the primary visual cortex is and the association areas. And in the temporal lobe you need to know where the visual cortex is. Oh, that shouldn't say visual, that should say auditory. So please cross that out if you are writing notes, and I'll make sure in class that I've actually fixed that up as well. So the temporal lobe includes the auditory cortex, which is for sound or hearing, Wernicke's area, which has got to do with language, and the association areas as well. So that's a bit of a list of what you're going to have to know where to locate in the brain. and also you're going to have to know what the function of each of those are and what would happen if any of these were damaged. And that's basically going to be the function of the next week of information, and that will take us almost up to the next SAC. So stay tuned for another video next Thursday, and in the meantime you can spend some time revising over what we've done so far, because I'm looking forward to seeing some brilliant results again in this next SAC, which is the final SAC for Unit 3, halfway of the year done. Okay, I'll see you next Thursday.